Hello, everybody. It's great to be here, and it's great to see you all. Anil and I were talking about how, as we're walking around this conference, and you see all these people you haven't seen in a couple of years, or just people in general, it's kind of like you're coming back from the dead. You're just like so happy to see people, just to see a physical human. So great to be here, and thanks for coming. I'm Chad Wolf. I'm the Vice President of Security Assurance for AWS, and also the Compliance Officer. I've been at Amazon for about 12 years, and we doing this role, compliance at AWS. Anil, do you want to introduce
Yeah,
yourself?
good morning. I'm Anil Marcos. I am a director of our global audits and trust enablement team. So I run a global team of professionals that really manage all of our audits, third-party certifications, any of our customer audits, and so forth. So get to deal with a lot of our customers and a lot of our security expectations, if you will, in the market. I've been at AWS for about 2 years. Prior to this, I was in consulting. Today, we're going to cover a little bit about what does it mean to take a compliance program and move it really at scale. And the scale that we'll talk about, you'll see some numbers and hear some anecdotes today about what we mean by scale. One of the things that I will share with you is Chad and I both really are not coming from a compliance background. I have an engineering background. I've been in security operations most of my career. And Chad also has a very heavy security background. So we really come at this problem a little bit differently than probably traditionally someone that has grown up in compliance and has thought about compliance in a different way. We looked at all of this and said, let's just assume this is a net new problem, and how would we solve that problem? And so in the next 50 minutes or so, we're going to cover about 5 examples. We'll dive deep into these examples, talk about how a traditional kind of teaching of solving that problem may have been kind of done in the market, and then really how we have approached it. And in some cases, it may make sense. In some cases, you may look at it and go, that's a really odd way to go solve that problem. But that's really what we hope to cover today, and we'll get right into it.
Yeah. And just a side note, when I interviewed for this job, I was telling everybody in the interview loop, I know nothing about compliance, just so you know. And they all said, that's okay. We want you to look at the problem from an objective standpoint without kind of the baggage of that. So that's kind of worked for us. So today we're just going to talk, as Anil said, we're going to talk a little bit about whether or not we're thinking correctly about the problem of solving for compliance. The main problem that we kind of saw at the beginning was that you've got this business, AWS, that's moving very rapidly. We're developing a lot of content, a lot of services. We're producing them quickly. We're iterating on them quickly. We're listening to customers. We're basically moving very, very quickly. However, the compliance programs that we initially took on were not like that. They were, ISO, SAS 70, if you remember SAS 70s, and PCI compliance. These were all legacy compliance programs that just didn't change. They didn't, they had some accommodation for compensating controls and whatnot, or the SAS 70 had the ability to define your own controls. But the reality was the objective and kind of the way that they were tested and the way that they were approached by the auditors was I don't know, back in the early days of the Security and Exchange Act and the initial accounting firms. So the methodologies there have been in place and have been maturing and solidifying over decades. So the idea that you would have point-in-time evaluation of controls, PCI is a very point-in-time kind of thing. The idea that you'd have you'd go look back in the last 6 months of all the control operation that's going on in a certain environment, and kind of trying to analyze what happened in the past. It is very, it's just because of this unique way of evaluating that and providing assurance to customers and to auditors, it really wasn't that agile. It kind of followed the waterfall approach of development. So, but at the same time, we've got a lot of these security controls, because this is in AWS, it's mostly a pure security play. Most of these security threats, like Log4j or SolarWinds, et cetera, are moving fast, and we need to account for them in our compliance program. So, and in addition, like there's a lot of geopolitical changes. There's a lot of regulation changes. There's a lot of things that are happening very quickly, and the standards themselves just aren't really keeping up.
Yeah, and a couple of things that I usually kind of try to explain when people ask like what I'm focused on a daily basis. I'm really sitting in the intersection of two high levels of permutations. I mean, one is all the global regulations and standards and requirements that are going on. We're operating in over 100 countries in every single sector, financial services, healthcare, government, every single regulated sector we're operating in. And then on the other side of this, we have over 250 digital products, if you will, if you think about services as products, that are all code-based, and they're constantly in agile, they're constantly releasing new code. And so you have this high-frequency transactional permutation going on the services side because we're innovating and we're trying to be best product for our customers. And then you have these regulations that are constantly changing, and how do you match this up really is the problem we're trying to solve. In a way where it's not lots of humans running around trying to match this up. And so how do you systematically and mechanistically solve that problem? And so that's really I look at that as that's the crux of the job. And we're really looking at an opportunity to, potentially disrupt the way compliance has really been thought of.
Yeah. Okay, so we're going to, during this this presentation, we're going to go through 5 areas, 5 things that we did differently, or we diverted from the the traditional way to do compliance. Some of these things are maybe totally obvious to you, some not, but these are definitely 5 areas where because we looked at the problem differently, we took a different approach than what was in the industry. And the first thing is we threw out the common control framework. So I can't really...
Say no, Chad.
Say what?
Say no.
So I can't really see you all very well, but I mean, how many of you have to deal with a common control framework? Okay, a few people, at least that I can see. I can't even see anybody on this side, but okay, so a common control framework, that's when you, if you have like 3 or 4 control frameworks that you need to adhere to, instead of like doing those audits that are all dissimilar, you try to combine them into one control objective and that accommodates the different permutations of the control and the different certifications. So if there's a password control like objective, having strong password controls, and then you walk it through and say, well, PCI requires this, ISO requires this, our SOC 2 report requires this, and they're a little bit different. So you try to craft a statement that you can hand over to the service team owner or the business owner and say, hey, you own this control of password control, or a better example might be change control. You own this control. Can you sign off on it to make sure you're doing it? And then they have to look at it. Instead of giving them 3 different controls to look at and sign off on, you're just giving them 1. So that's the idea of the common control framework. It's meant to simplify the work. But in our case, we had to throw it out. We had to throw it out because there were just too many. Like, how many audits do we do, Anil? Like
This year we'll clear over 300.
300 audits,
Yeah.
and they're all kind of different, right? Like they're all, some are customer audits, some are certifications, some are regulatory audits, and they're all just subtly different.
I think the big challenge here is a common control framework works if, like the picture says, if you can get everything to go on the same rails that you lay down. So a common control framework is, aside from a unified control framework, which you take all the standards and you mush them together, you say, what's that unified control framework? A common control framework is really, you're taking the approach of trying to get the entire business to align to a set of controls. But what that does is it really starts to limit your innovation abilities. It starts to really say, if we have 200 and something services, that are all trying to be agile, that are all trying to innovate on their own pace, and you want the freedom for the developers to go do whatever they feel is the right way to build their product, when you start putting rails on the ground and you say this is the only way you could do whatever, access, encryption, change control, it starts to like become less freedom for them to move. And so, the common control framework works, I think, if you have 3 or 4 businesses or a very common set of businesses and you want to set some parameters there. What we figured out is we want to really, really tune the business for high-speed innovation. And when you want to tune the business for high-speed innovation, it's almost like you got a fighter pilot that wants to take that plane wherever they want to move it, and it's not like every plane is going to move the same way, but you build the plane the same way, and you know that the plane's going to operate as designed, but the operator has a lot of freedom to move it to wherever they want. Whereas a train driver does not have the freedom to move that train off the rails. And so it's really kind of just an analogy, but our environment is really, really tuned around the builder's ability to innovate and high-speed innovation. And so because of this, we really had to focus on the evidencing game, which is how are they meeting these requirements, and how do we get speed around evidence versus really trying to force a bunch of builders to follow the same path around common controls.
Yeah. Kind of a fun anecdote is when we were first trying to get our ISO certification long ago, we brought in a firm to come give us a gap assessment. Come provide a gap analysis of where we are and if we can get the certification and what's missing, what kind of documentation and controls we need to put in place. And so the firm came on site, started their work, and it was kind of taking a long time. It was taking multiple weeks. And so in the meantime, I'm getting a little frustrated. I'm like, how can this take so long? And so I said to my coworker, I'm like, let's just...
Wait, Chad, was that a time and materials engagement? There's
probably
a reason why it took so long.
Yeah, should have done fixed contract, darn it. Anyway, so while they were doing it, I said on the side to my coworker, like, let's just go get the certification while they're doing that work. So we hired another firm, a certification firm, to come do it. And they did the entire certification, and they were like, you don't have this document. And then we would like stay up all night pounding out the document. You don't have this control, and we'd go talk to the service team leads and like understand how the control is being operated. And and then at the end they're like, okay, you're done. And so then we were finished, and we got the certification. And then in the meantime, the other firm is just still working, working in the background. And then about a week and a half after we got the certification, we didn't tell them, but after we got the certification, the firm came back with their gap analysis, and they showed us all these gaps that we had. And you can imagine kind of how much I was enjoying that meeting of them telling me all the gaps that we had, and we said, okay, thank you. We did pay them, so that was we did meet our time materials contract, but we did get the certification, and it was kind of like what we're talking about here, like the better way, instead of establishing a framework and doing in some cases a formal extensive gap analysis with somebody with limited understanding of how the security is actually operated. There are limitations to what they can understand and provide. So to their credit, they were doing the due diligence, but just didn't understand it as deeply as we did. And then instead of doing that, we're doing something that's more agile, understands in depth how security is already baked in, and instead of creating a layer of bureaucracy over it, we're just extracting out of the business like the way they're conducting their business, and in some cases they're unaware of any controls that they owned or any control objectives they were meeting. They were simply doing their job with the security built into their programs.
Yeah, I mean, one thing I'd add is there are some complexities to this. When we are doing 300 plus audits a year, there are some auditors that have a very rigid mindset of, this is the control, we need to see this exact control implemented this way. And, a lot of times when you have this freedom of innovation and the essence of the control is being met, meaning the risk is being mitigated, but there's some creativity in how that risk is being mitigated, we have to kind of lean in and really kind of challenge the auditor to say, we're not going to take a control that is very prescriptive and then push that control across the entire organization. What we're going to understand is what is the essence of that control? What's the risk that this control is trying to mitigate? If that's being met by the baking in of security, then we really go back and say, here's the evidence that shows that the risk is really being mitigated. And so there's some education that really has to be done in a lot of our cases, because we're really, in a lot of cases, we have auditors, especially in some of the newer markets that are just adopting cloud. They don't understand cloud, they don't understand distributed systems, they don't understand how agile works. So there's a lot of education that has to go into kind of making an approach like this work, because it's not going to be, here's all of our controls, and you can go anywhere in the world in our environment, and you're going to find all these controls exactly the way we write it. It's, what's the essence of this control, and we can prove to you that the intent of the control is being met, and we can evidence that.
Yeah. All right, so let's go to the second item. The second one, the necessity to build our own engineering team. Now, if any of you are in an audit compliance function, you'll be keenly aware of this problem. Like most audit findings relate to something around you have a manual process and you need to automate it, or you don't have a tool or any kind of mechanism for this thing to ensure that the controls will operate all the time, and you need to automate it. And in fact, audits get exponentially easier when things are automated. Instead of doing a population sampling, they just do a test of one. And so engineering work in security or in compliance is required. In our case, we built our own team. Now, I do know a lot of people saying they have their own teams, or they're borrowing their engineers. But I mean, from my perspective, like borrowing engineers just doesn't work. I mean, there's many situations over the years at Amazon where, we started out with really good intentions, like, Chad, we're going to give you 2 FTEs. It's not going to be the same people, but it's going to be 2 full-time equivalents of engineering work for the whole year. Like, either I funded it or something, and they're like, these 2, headcount are definitely for you, I promise. And or like fist bumping and like, pinky promising and all that stuff. And so then during the year, the attention kind of wanes and fades, because these engineers are also working on revenue generating, products. They're doing some big exciting something, innovating. They're going to launch something for reInvent. They're going to do something exciting. And so over the year, they spend less and less time, and then eventually the hammer drops, and somebody says, my GM is telling me that I need to stop working on your stuff and work on this super critical thing. We're about to miss our date. And then we have no engineering resources.
I think there's a kind of a tipping point as well. I mean, I think if you have a small audit function with 1 to 2 audits, I mean, you could kind of make the argument, what would a dedicated engineering team really work on? Because you don't have as much of an automation requirement or so forth. And so, a lot of kind of peers of mine that are, at various customers I talk to, they start off with really either they're using contractors, or they're outsourcing the engineering functions, or they are basically borrowing, as Chad said, an engineering function. But then they find that it's just not, they're not getting the outcomes that they want, right? When you have a built-in engineering team that really is native with your business, if you will, they really understand the nuances. In our case specifically, we found that the engineering team, like, we have to really, when you're borrowing it, we have to train really a new person every couple of months. Like, we get a couple of resources. They now understand how the audit business works. They go back to their core jobs, and then the next time we have an automation requirement or a workflow requirement, we get a set of new engineers. They don't understand how the audit business works, and so then there's a lot of retraining. So very frustrating for my team. With the dedicated team, everything from little concepts like, a equally qualified professional has to be able to reproduce the same work that you did and draw the same conclusion that you did. As auditors or people that are in the compliance arena, you understand that in the fact that, like, if we pull evidence, an independent auditor has to be able to go through the same exact steps, pull the same exact population, pull the same exact samples, go through the same exact test procedures, and draw the same conclusion that you drew. And so there's a data lineage problem in a lot of cases of, are the logs there? Did we retain enough? Where did we get the source system? And so if we take shortcuts, meaning we did a one-time script, we pulled it from here, never kept the script, never did the documentation of what was the filters that were applied, then you get a bunch of evidence that got you through the audit, and then someone comes back and tries to reproduce that work, and it's just never going to work because there's a bunch of steps here that no one documented. And so it's little things like that that we've found that just having an engineering team native makes it a little bit easier because they understand these nuances of reproduction of work. They understand the nuances of independence and things like that. So this is where I think for a small organization, if it's just 1 or 2 audits, you could easily probably get away with a borrowed amount of time because of the inefficiency is not noticeable. I think when you get to the point where you're today in the digital world where you have multiple audits, multiple customer interactions going on, the frequency of these audits are so high that you really want to get a dedicated engineering team in place that can really understand the nuances. We are today using engineering for everything, not just the automation of the back-end plumbing of pulling evidence, but the audit business itself. How do we think about workflow? How do we think about the different organizations that have to sign off on evidence, whether that's legal, whether that's other organizations that have their stakeholders, meaning they own the control of the evidence. We're thinking about things like redaction. How do you do that at scale? The platforms from which customers interact with the evidence. All of this is very, very specific technology built for this business. And instead of just using a commoditized engineering function, we're really doubling down on a purpose-built engineering function that really understands audit, and we're finding extreme levels of efficiency through that.
Yeah, in addition, we can create a richer environment for the auditors themselves. I mean, as Anil said, we have over 300 audits a year, so if you think about what an audit entails, it entails them generating a list, an audit request list, and then giving it to us and us kind of trying to meld together what they're looking for versus what we have or how we're built, and then going and gathering the evidence and reviewing the evidence and doing interviews and then drawing conclusions, issuing a report, findings with us responding to the findings. That's this long audit process that can be really, really painful, or it can be greatly streamlined and actually be a positive experience. So over the pandemic, we actually, with our own engineering team, were able to digitize a lot of that process. The narratives, the interviews, things like that. We have our own platform, which an auditor can go into and browse and learn all that information and see the interviews that give them kind of the general basic education, or interviews about the controls with the vice president of the service that they're evaluating, things like that. It helps them have a richer, more streamlined experience rather than trying to get this stuff all scheduled out. And so having our own engineers really allowed us to build, and not only build quickly and scale, but also create an actual better experience for the auditors themselves.
Yeah, I think the digital audit concept that you just mentioned is a great example of this. I mean, if we didn't have a dedicated engineering function, when COVID started, we had lots of folks that would, the way we did audits, especially customer audits, is, we'd fly customers into Seattle or somewhere, do large symposiums, walk you through the evidence, walk you through when COVID happened and you couldn't do that, I mean, we had a couple of folks just kind of really think big about how could you completely look at this problem differently. And we started noticing a lot of conferences at the time were doing these things where it was virtual conferences. You had these avatars where you could go in, register for the conference, and then you could, pick your hair color, pick your height, pick your little, icon that walked around the booths. And then we noticed that, hey, they're walking around these conferences as if they're actually there, and they're interacting with people, and they're going to the various security vendor booths and getting the same experience. And we said, what if we built a platform where we just could have customers now, or regulators or auditors, instead of coming on site or us trying to do this through Zoom in a very hokey way, we could just build a virtual environment where you could make yourself 6'5" if you want, and and look like a superstar, and you could walk around the conference floor, and we could give you education, we could give you a bunch of certification type stuff. Plus, you could cover off on all the audit steps that you want, whether it's visit a data center. And so having an engineering team dedicated to us just said, hey, okay, this is not like, this is doable. We could take our engineering function and pivot to this new kind of use case and really go big on this idea. And so this is something we're working on right now. And, and I think, as Chad, as you were mentioning it, I was just thinking, had we not had a dedicated engineering team, every team was trying to figure out how to pivot during COVID, we would not have been able to execute on that.
Yeah. And as a side note, we we made it so when you perform the audit using this digital audit symposium, you could get CPE, continuing education credits, which made like all these people want to suddenly audit us. So it's kind of backfired maybe, but it's a good experience. You get this better experience, plus you get CPEs for just doing your job. So it's a win all around for the customers. Okay. Anil, why don't you take this one?
Yeah, disrupted the ownership structure for audits. Traditionally, a lot of our audits were vertically aligned. So if you had, for example, PCI, you had a single-threaded owner that owned the PCI program. So this is a person that had a lot of knowledge around PCI's framework, how the audits work. That person also managed, everything from the contract with the external vendor. They managed the audit request list of the types of things that were going to be in scope for this year's audit. They would manage the interaction with our control owners and get the pieces of evidence that are needed. They would then work with legal to get permission to release certain things or any kind of escalations that are needed. They were basically the shepherd of that audit, if you will, and they would move that everything vertically from the contract with the external party and the timing of that audit all the way to the evidence, and then ultimately even remediation or issues that were found. They were the single-threaded owner for making sure that those issues were closed out and funding and resources were aligned to it. What we found is that makes a lot of sense when you have 2 or 3 audits. When you're doing 300 audits, now you have 300 of these things going on with very little cross-pollination of best-of-breed things. And so we really approach this as almost like Henry Ford's assembly line approach to say, well, what are the key functional areas in every audit, regardless of whether it's a PCI audit, regardless of if it's C5 or ISO or SOC, a type of report. It doesn't matter. There's a bunch of like macro level steps that all of these audits go through, and how can we start really thinking about this horizontally and really give single-threaded ownership around particular problem areas. And the one that we really went after hard was the evidence management piece. We found everybody was going into the builder side or the service team side and trying to get their own pieces of evidence, and we weren't bringing, there was a quality issue there. We weren't bringing the best evidence all the time. There's a lot of churn there. SLAs were being harder to get to. And we said, well, what if we went horizontal on evidence and said, we just have a dedicated team that's going to be almost like a shared service that will get your evidence.
Yeah. Looking at this in this different way was kind of driven by our kind of customer obsession for our business. A lot of, really the gathering of the evidence and doing the interviews is the part of these audits that really impact our service teams. They don't know about the control framework. There's no work there, but because there is no control framework. But when it comes down to us interacting with them, we are asking them for evidence. We're asking them for, screenshots. We're asking them for, data dumps. We're asking them for data sets or something else. So as we go through and try to, as we've been doing that initially with this traditional way of ownership, Mary would go to the service teams and ask them for all this information. And then John would go back maybe at the same time, overlapping, or a different time, going and asking for similar information or the same information. And so as we did that, we realized that the experience for the builder is very poor. And with us scaling to 300 audits, it's impossible to do that with that approach. We cannot possibly go with, well, first off, we can't get 300 specialists just for every single audit, and then secondly, we can't be hitting the service teams up. We need to allow them to innovate and scale with the guardrails and controls in place. But so as we've been doing this, and as we've been figuring out how to do this in the Henry Ford way to do it, the assembly line way, we've realized that we can get much, much more efficient in gathering evidence and reusing evidence and indexing across evidences. And in some cases, like we've had audits that take zero impact on service teams. In fact, probably a majority of our audits, we'd say, don't impact our service teams at all because we know what the evidence is, we know how to gather it, and our evidence team is making sure that we're highly indexed on what's available and how to retrieve it.
Yeah, the other big, from my point of view, the other big real advantage is when you start doing apples to apples comparison horizontally, you really can zone in on root cause issues that are causing inefficiencies. When you know, to Chad's point, when you have Mary running her audit and whatever the other guy's name was. It was John, yeah. John running his audit. You know, it's Mary has a bunch of problems. John has a bunch of problems. These problems are not exactly the same. They're all frustrated trying to solve their own, you know, issues of why they're blocked somewhere in the way. But when you go, you know, we're going to do an audit request list of what does the auditor want in a standardized way. This is the template. There's 500 things on that list. This is how we kind of negotiate scope. That's standardized. We think about the interaction model, meaning is it tickets, is it emails, is it phone calls, the interaction model for how that then moves to the next step. We think about the evidence kind of process. We think about, you know, the preparation of the evidence, whether things have to be redacted, signed off, legal review. There's a bunch of evidence prep step that has to happen, and that's a heavy workflow kind of area. And then you're going to end up with findings, right? Every one of these audits, you're going to have some remediation findings, and then you have to kind of think about how to do all that. If you think about this at a macro level of 6 or 7 steps, you could then go, okay, across 300 audits, why did this one audit have an issue with, you know, the audit request list? And you go, okay, there's something here that allows you to dive in because all of my other 200 and something audits didn't have that issue. Or you look at an SLA that's broken on how evidence was produced. You just know very quickly something has changed in that mechanism that caused that SLA to break. And so we're really getting to the point where when you get to scale, really thinking about it more functionally than just deliver the audit and execute a successful audit. So we still have ownership, but I'd say the ownership is now matrix. There are owners that are responsible to get the audits done and get the desired outcome on the audit. So they have vertical ownership, but then there's horizontal ownership to say you have to think about mechanisms, you got to think about process, and you got to think about efficiency and tooling at the right time. And so they have a completely different thing. Every now and then there's collisions between the horizontal and the vertical, and that's perfectly okay. That just means that there's an opportunity to improve something there.
Yeah, and all these efforts, everything we're doing enables us to do one thing that we're doing as the core reason or tenet of all these things, and that is we're working backwards from the customer. In this case, there's the auditor customer, and then there's the service team or the business owner customer. By doing this, we can tell exactly how much impact we're having on the service teams and what kind of overhead compliance and audit is causing, and then track that and track it so it goes, you know, down to, well, hopefully 0 someday, but I don't know if we'll get to actually 0, but it goes down over time in relation to how many audits we're doing. And so that's something that's a true business value that we're bringing to the business, because otherwise this would be a crazy, huge burden and tax on the business itself.
I'd love this job if we just hit a button and 300 audits just happen with 0 impact.
Yeah, we're thinking of just doing Alexa, Alexa, perform my audit, gather all the evidence and see if we could get that to work.
That's right.
Okay. Number 4, we're moving beyond sampling. Now, the sample methodology, if you're not familiar with it, is where you where you take all of the instantiations of what you're examining, and you take a sample of them and examine just the sample. So, for example, change control. How many changes did you do this last year? Oh, we did, well, let's say traditionally, a traditional business. We did, 25 major changes moved to production. And so the auditor would say, our methodology requires that we do 25 or 20%, and so we need this many. We need 5 samples. We're going to check to see if they're authorized. We're going to check to see if they're properly tested and moved to production. And then they review the 5, and then they kind of check off like, yes, change control is working effectively. So when we first started doing this with our auditors, the auditor would come and say, how many changes did you do in the past period? And we'd say, 500,000. And they'd say,
I'll look at 2.
yeah, they'd say, well, we're supposed to look at 25% or 20%, but that's too many. Our cap is 20. Or maybe the cap is, is that right, 20?
10, 20.
10,
Yeah.
10 or 20. Our cap is 10. And so they're going to look at 10 of the 500,000 changes that went into production. Now, at that point, like 5 out of 500,000 is statistically irrelevant. Like, you're not going to get a good assurance that all controls are operating if you're only testing 5 out of 500,000. So, and in this case, like if a single sample fails, then they increase the size of the sample, and then they go ahead and finish the testing. So. The reality is, the challenge with that, obviously, is that we're not providing a lot of assurance. So, and we're providing really no comfort to customers, and we're not really looking at the whole of it. So, we decided there is definitely a better way to do this.
Yeah, a couple thoughts here is, our goal here is not just to pass audits. So you could say, why would you disrupt this? I mean, you could easily produce the 10 samples, you can get through the audit, pass the audit. I'd say one of the nuances here is we sit in the first line. We sit in the CISO organization. Security is our job. We're not just doing this just to get through audits. We are really trying to make sure that the environment is secure, and we're really trying to make sure that we are raising the bar to the point where we can get to 100% assurance. And we want to find things. Just because an auditor doesn't find things doesn't mean that we're happy with that answer. And so this is an opportunity where, if through 100% sampling or looking at the entire population, we can be really assured that there isn't an issue in the environment, or that if there is a control failure, we could really have an opportunity to dive deep and go, well, what's the root cause here, and what caused that failure to occur? Because, like I said, you have this permutation of X number of services that are constantly in agile. Anything could change in that environment at any given time. And so this is an indicator for us where, if we're testing 100% continuously, it's an indicator for us that something has changed here that we're not aware of. And so this is one of those things where I don't think that the market would ever dictate that you got to get here very quickly. For at least for the next 5, 6, 7 years, we may be able to get away with 10% sampling on getting through audits. But the question is that what your customers expect you to do if you're really running security? And so in a digital world where we have this permutation on the environmental side, and then you have really a customer expectation, and this is where kind of, in my job around the global audits, I also think it's about trust enablement. There's an opportunity here to say, yes, we are hitting the minimum bar of 10 samples, but we are trying to earn trust here, and I want to be able to say we actually have looked at the entire population. And so this is where the great opportunity to kind of forget the sample size, forget what's minimally required here, but really go after the innovation that's there to say, can we use things like automated reasoning? Can we use real automation to kind of fetch at a high frequency rate on a particular control, and really look at get real comfort around the control environment.
Yeah. And maybe you've heard about us using automated reasoning in different areas. I think Kurt talked about it in the keynote. But this is one of the techniques. Automated reasoning and proving that a certain state is true is pretty like a significant shift in the audit world, because before, like, traditionally you're just getting reasonable assurance because there's no way to actually, in any kind of manual environment, there's no way to actually examine all the instantiations of what you're talking about. 500,000 changes, encryption across millions of drives. You can't do it. You can't examine them, and sampling doesn't really do much. But using automated reasoning, which is kind of proving mathematically that it actually is a true state, is giving us more of 100% assurance rather than reasonable assurance that a certain control is in place.
Yeah. I mean, areas that are ripe for this is when you have questions like particular access, you don't want certain access combinations to occur. That's a binary question. That's either occurred or not occurred. There's no gray area there or judgment. You may have some judgment associated with exceptions, but there's no judgment. It's either a fact that it's occurred or it hasn't. Encryption being in a particular data store, that encryption is either there or the encryption is not. Segmentation, like that part of the network or that path is segmented or it's not segmented. And so we're really looking at areas where the control is not judgmental, but the control is really more of a binary pass-fail, and then really going in and saying, can we develop continuous monitoring around those types of controls to say, just tell me when that control fails, and the failure, the criteria for failure is very simple.
Yeah. Okay, so 5, we talked a little bit about this, but making compliance a customer-driven business. Traditionally, again, as we talk about the audit process, it's a long, laborious process, and there's little interaction with, usually a back-end compliance process doesn't really interact with customers. They don't really ever, talk to analysts. They don't deal with regulators. They deal with regulators that are examining them, but not necessarily reaching out and engaging proactively the regulators. But in this way, we have moved our organization from being this administrative overhead to a customer-obsessed way of responding to all of our different customers. And we would probably categorize our different customers in 3 categories: the builders, the service teams, the auditors themselves, and then the regulators and the policymakers or lawmakers, where they're making regulation that then has to be executed by the regulators.
Yeah, I think this is a market shift that's going on from compliance to trust. This is an opportunity for any organization to really show and build that kind of relationship with your end customer and your internal customers to show that security is kind of job one, security is in place. The audit mentality, historically has always been as if you're talking to, lawyers in a deposition. It's, ask me a question and maybe I'll answer the question. Maybe I'll tell you why that's out of scope. Maybe I'll tell you why you didn't ask the question correctly. And we've all learned that game as, if you kind of grew up in security or you grew up in incident response or things like that. It was very much a sit there and let them ask the right question, and until they ask the right question, just keep staring. And it's just probably the worst way to kind of build trust in a digital arena. I mean, if you want customers to really adopt your product, you want them to believe that security is really, we have to lean in and really kind of create that transparency. And so this approach to be customer obsessed, I think on the customer side really is, everything from that, the digital virtual environment that I talked about earlier to getting to 100% population testing. These are all attempts to show that we are on the job and we're taking care of this. But on the backside of with the service kind of builders, we want to show that we are kind of taking the pain away from them. We're doing a lot of this in an automated way, and so there's an opportunity for the business not to be a cost center, not to be a what you would hear things like cost of doing business. It's a necessary evil. This can be an accelerator to the business because we are really explaining how security is being implemented in the regulated market.
Yeah, I got kind of tired of being called evil, necessary evil. So, the great thing about taking it from a customer-obsessed approach and being a customer kind of engaging function is you can do things like, measure revenue impact. And if you can measure revenue impact, we have influenced revenue, or we talk about how much, which accounts that we've positively impacted, contributed to. Then that's when you get funded for things like, your own engineering team, and you get funded for things like doing a digital audit symposium and things like that. So as we've gone through this and done this the better way, it was the right thing to do, but as a positive benefit or a positive byproduct of this, we're able to get better funding and get better staffed, and we get the right kind of people on the team to really look at these problems and in a business-centric or customer-centric way.
Yeah, another example I would just share is just as the world becomes more global in a lot of these like business models, and we become more digital. I mean, we're also finding nuances of cultural expectations. You know, where some markets are expecting senior people to be in the room because it is the cultural expectation, meaning you respect their time and you respect the rank of the auditor that's there. They're expecting, you know, certain types of SLAs or transparency. And so we're really, even from a customer obsession standpoint, really looking at it to say, not how do we do audits, but how does that auditor expect us to do the audit, right? And really trying to say, can we work backwards from their expectation? In certain markets, we are really putting a lot of boots on the ground or infrastructure on the ground from a human capital standpoint, because we know that that in-person relationship matters in certain markets. In other markets, they're very digital, very okay with operating out of a US person on Chime or Zoom and that. But it's really working backwards from those expectations is an opportunity, and this is we're leaning in really hard.
Yeah. So that's it, the 5 areas where we've really thought differently about this problem. It's been a real great pleasure to be here, and again, thanks for coming.
Yeah, thanks for the opportunity to talk to you, all of you. This was by no means the only 5 things that we're working on. I don't want anybody to walk away going, Chad's got a pretty easy job. He's only got 5 things to worry about. But this is just an example where we could go in 50 minutes and dive deep on 5 examples. But you know, happy to, you know, our contact information is there if anybody has any follow-up questions and wants to reach out. Thank you.
Thank you.